On mic today, we have Dan Decker, host of the podcast Bourbon and Bad Decisions. How you doing today, buddy?
Doing pretty good. It is great to have a conversation with you again. Haven't had you on my show. Being here is an absolute pleasure.
And actually, I will point that out is that I was on your show a few months back, and there's a good chance this may become a part two to that conversation. So I'm going to put that episode in the show notes. But I like the concept of your show because there are a lot of podcasts out there. That's not even up for discussion. And there are a lot of people who do shows about, hey, let's put two Star Trek fans in the same room and have them talk about their favorite episode. And there's a
Right.
lot of podcasts where it's like, hey, let's try to talk about what we would do if we were in charge. But your show is let's sit down with the podcaster and talk about their life story. And that's news to me.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It is, it's been a an idea brewing for some time now, and I like talking to people. If you haven't noticed, I like to yammer on, and I like to get to know folks. And I figured we obviously have a shared common interest or passion with Trek or sci-fi or whatever else the connection might be. But specifically with our friends on Twitter, let's get to know the person behind the avatar. Let's find and so far, as we come to near the end of the year and wind down the first season, I have enjoyed absolutely every conversation, and I feel like I've taken away a learn, and I hope that that's been shared with the audience and the folks at large. But it's been a lot of fun.
And I really the idea appeals to me because when I first got on the internet in the mid 90s, it was very, if you did some research and found somebody posted something you liked, you would go to their website and read their bio and maybe even jot an email to them and say, "Hey, I like what you're doing. Do you want to communicate?" That wasn't weird. And now for some reason it is weird, and I think you're getting back to that.
Yeah, exactly. Or just the idea of, when I first got over the hump and put out the first episode, and one thing to note for your listeners, your primary releases are on Thursday for exactly the same reason that mine are, and that's we've never gotten the hang of it, and hopefully this helps, right? But just reaching out to people. The first several shows, I just put a blast out on Twitter, and that was several hundred followers ago. And so I got a really strong response. I ended up with a lot of content in the can, as it were. And while that was a great way to kick things off, I learned as we've gone on. Now I have better equipment, so listening back to those episodes is a little rough compared to what I could do now, and having so much front loaded. I want to have it a little closer, to their release date, so that it isn't months away from getting to hear them. But yeah, just reaching out to those folks. I would like to talk to this person. Is it someone I already know? That's pretty great. Is it someone that I would like to talk to personally? I've reached out to those folks as well. And like you said, one person that I was able to get in touch with, I had to find his email address on his website. But guess what? He's been on the show, and that episode's coming up. And it was, for me, sometimes it's about, being selfish. And I admit every episode it's about being selfish. I'm the one that wants to learn this. I would call these people on the telephone and talk to them. We may as well turn on the microphones.
And that's a heck of a good point. But I think that it's less than selfish, and it's more just building a community, which is something that we talk about on the audio portion of this show a lot. We end every episode by saying, "Here's what we can do to build the followership of this show." And that's partially selfish, but it's
Hmm.
also like, hey, we're all stuck in our houses more so right now than ever. We're trying to find ways to connect with people. Let's make it just a little bit easier.
Right. And the vast majority of the folks that I get the opportunity and the pleasure to interact with on Twitter feel like people that I would just want to hang out with anyway. and reminding everyone right now, especially that we're all just kind of in this together in this weird time. I think it gives us a chance to stay connected. And some folks, they're like, "Oh, this is the first time I've ever been on a podcast," and I'm like, "Well, surprise! It's the first time I've ever podcasted." So, and just trying to everyone's like, "Oh, I don't have an interesting story." Yeah, no, you do. Everyone has an interesting story, and that you just have to talk to somebody and be willing to listen to find it. And it just felt like something that I've been brewing on it for 4 years, and now was the time. Once I was shown that the barriers are much lower to being able to put a show out, changed a lot of things.
So, what kind of feedback have you got on the show so far?
A lot of good feedback.
Great.
The community has seemingly responded very well. I have what they call the cult of 20 or the cult of 25. A steady listenership, and that's I counted today, and it really is worldwide. Several countries, and then within the United States, several of the states have listenership. So it's very humbling and rewarding to, maybe it's one person in each place, but there's somebody across the world listening to me talk to my friend. That's it's very cool. As I like to say lately, the internet is a weird place, in some of the best and worst ways. But it's, like I said, it's very gratifying, but also very humbling to have folks who are willing to listen. And it's interesting to watch as folks come along, and each episode gets a new listener. And then, because as new guests come on, they bring a little bit, like you said, how do we help grow the audience? They bring a little bit more people along the way with them, and it's really cool.
And that's something that it takes a while to build that, and it's frustrating to some people. It's poison for anybody who is into instant gratification. This is not your bag if that's the way your mind works.
Not at all.
But I think that when you figure how many billions of people are on the planet, and the vast majority of them have some form of connection to the internet, if we can connect in any way, shape, or form, let's give it a try.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the beautiful thing about where we are now. It has never been easier to facilitate community than it is these days. Even though we're separated by time and distance, we are connected through this ether that allows us to, heck, most of the folks, or a good number of the folks that I've spoken to, especially recently, are ahead of me, and that interesting scheduling opportunities. If you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons, you know that that's difficult enough with people who are local, let alone people who are 6 hours ahead of you. And so making that game work, takes that extra effort. But I've found people who are willing to do it. And when we get to be able to be there in a group, and especially, Trek brings us together as it's a passion that draws us together, but finding those other opportunities to connect where you get to learn something about, oh, these people like to play Dungeons and Dragons too. I like to play Dungeons and Dragons. They're willing to cut a wide swath of slack to a new dungeon master. And I, as a dungeon master, am more interested in having a really good time than I am about trying to slay my players. So, I think just those kinds of things, building those kinds of connections outside of what brought us together is a lot of fun.
I think, when you say the scheduling opportunities, that really hits home with me, because one of my favorite shows in terms of scheduling and in terms of content, honestly, was the episode with Lee Sargent, an illustrator out of Australia. We got together and we both really wanted to do the show, but the time difference was brutal.
15 hours.
So we decided the best thing to do was for me to start the show at midnight.
Yeah.
Which, that just made the most sense. And oddly, it was so much fun because the whole rest of the world was asleep. I had no responsibilities at that hour of the evening. We could just sit back and have a grand old time. And after we stopped recording, we kept talking just because, hey, we both have nothing else to do, and we both like Ghostbusters, and we both like Star Trek, and we both like comic books. It was just we just had that time where it's like, let's just have this.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I have a few, and there may be more than I know, but at least two folks that I interact with regularly that are in Australia. And so, yeah, I have a few world clocks on one of my widgets for my iPhone, and the Sydney clock is one of them, just to remind me that people I know are that far away. You know, and one of them, Damien, we've been friends for well over a decade now. We met through web development. Speaking of mutual interests, and at the time, our employment, and then the gentleman Dax on Twitter is also in Australia, and he's a lot of fun to interact with. But yeah, it's yeah, that's what I've been thinking about, because I want to reach out to both of them at some point for my show, and yeah, it's going to be a bit of a pickle to, especially like you say, when a bunch of us get to talking our passions and interests and fandoms, the conversation is really hard to wind down.
When I started on your show, you asked me where I came from and how I arrived on this planet, which was a great intro. I'm going to ask you a slightly different question.
Sure.
How did you find yourself on the internet for the first time? And what did you do?
Man, yeah. Wow, that is a great question. So my official that I can remember was either, it would have been my uncle, Alvin is only 3 years older than me. We're very close in age. So, he went off to college before I did, and I ended up going to the same school just up the street at University of Central Arkansas. And with that, he had a Mac, a little Mac Classic, I think, or Classic 2, and he used America Online. And my first connection, I think he even had at one point, but I remember my first connection being through his computer, through his America Online account. And then so fast forward just a couple of years, when I showed up to school at UCA as well, and he showed me the computer labs and how to get on the internet, and that was my first exposure to the internet. And of course, one of the very first things he showed me is like, this is how cool the internet is. He showed me, he went and scoured and found the an earlier release of or earlier draft of the Generations script, and printed it out on a dot matrix printer, no less, using the university resources.
My ears already hurt.
It was a lab printer, so it was far in the back, but it was dot matrix, and that thing, it went on forever. But yeah, I wish I might still have it at my mom's house in a box, but I doubt it. But yeah, big old thick stack of tractor fed printer paper that had the script for Generations and the original version of the Kirk death. And I tried to avoid those spoilers. I did not read that script until after I saw the movie. So,
well, it starts with the captain on the bridge. It ends with the bridge on the captain.
Yeah, basically. Oh, that's funny.
But okay, so my thought process was, when I first got on the internet, I did a lot of things involving things like email chains, email forums, and eventually Usenet and web forums a little bit later on. That was kind of the genesis of what I'm doing now. And I'm just looking back at Twitter and podcasts and the things that we're doing now, and just trying to make the connection between the stuff we were doing in the mid 90s, which sounds like about the same period of time for both you and me. And it's amazing how much it's grown, and in some ways how it's almost gone backwards.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it is. So, back in the earlier days, the access was a lot more not restricted, but it wasn't as accessible, because you had to know certain things to be able to get on the internet. Over time, of course, that's gotten to be easier. The barrier to entry for the internet is much lower. And it's on your phone now, which is very much the least thing that your phone does is be a phone, it seems. But so the folks who were on there were, probably more educated, especially since the internet started as a university project. And now it seems, with this democratization of access, everyone has the opportunity to express themselves, and these groups are easier to find. So yeah, it kind of feels like a regression in a way, in tone and intent. It's more about sharing opinions than information, which is fine. We should have a medium to express ourselves, but we should also, find a way to remain kind. And as great as it is, it's it's become a vehicle for, for false information just as much as the truth, and that's unfortunate.
I'd agree with all of that. Hey, it's like, again, since we have the same frame of reference, I've noticed a weird trend, and I try not to give too much negativity because it gets enough on its own.
Exactly.
But I'm reading, and I'll see something, make a comment, and then the person responds with, "I don't want you reading my tweets, and I don't want you commenting on them." And like, you can't stop me. You
Right.
put this on the where anybody on the planet can read it. So why did you do that if you don't want people to stop? It's like you don't understand the concept of the internet. Is that the point where we found ourselves?
I really, I have the same thought and feeling on that, because there are ways to protect your tweets if you don't want strangers to comment or be allowed part of the discourse. You can lock your account, or now you can restrict who can reply. That is a new feature, but the whole point of this was, when you speak out like that, the understanding, the part of the social media contract is that you're inviting discussion unless you aren't. And you don't, if you've put it out in an open forum, you don't get to decide really who you've made your choice by putting it out there, that this is something you want to discuss with people, be they your friends or be they strangers. And I have, sometimes I really disagree with people, and I respond in a way that, I wish maybe sometimes I hadn't. I don't like to knee jerk remove someone just because I disagree with them. But it happens from time to time. But yeah, if we're I've learned a lot about how to keep a more positive interaction, uh, formula, and it's to say what I think, um, with inviting back a discussion of, what do you think about this, and or keeping it open, but making sure that when I make my opinion, that I'm not coming across as fact, that this is what I enjoy about this aspect of this thing. What do you like about thing? Here, for example, the Refit Enterprise is my favorite design. What is your favorite starship design? That keeps it from being about my opinion, and invites discussion around it. But that's easy to do with something like starship designs, and a little less tenable with something like politics.
Sure. Well, let's kind of take an example that's right in the middle of the two, and I'll tell you how I tend to approach this, and I'm not sold on this approach, but it's done well so far.
Sure.
Somebody says something like, Star Trek Discovery is too political, or it's not political enough. I'm not going to pick a side. I'm just going to say that's where the argument starts.
Right.
And we realize there's going to be a disagreement. What I've done is I will say, well, my view is this. These are my reasons. Because of this, I think this. And they say, no, you're wrong. It's this, this, and this. And that's okay.
Yeah.
You can say it. As long as you present itself and you're polite, and you present it in a way that is, reasonable, I can listen to you. Then I'll come back and say, okay, I think this and this. And I will basically take what I said before, clarify it, put it in the context of what they just said. And what I will wait for is, do they take what I said and work with it? Or do they just restate whatever they said prior?
Right.
If we're restating what they said prior, and I can't say anything more because I've already said everything I can say, I'll restate it one more time and then I will back away. And whatever is said after that, they get the last word.
Sure. Yeah. And that, that is personally something, leaving the last word alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned that when someone wants to take the bully tactic, and I've avoided this more recently than for a lot of reasons, but if you just make them ridiculously uncomfortable with sassy nicknames, they tend to leave you alone and you get the last word. And it's because, you're just like, oh, okay. And I admittedly, it's marginally cruel and sometimes out of character for me, but I'm not mean about it. You're just poking them, at a certain
Mm-hmm.
point you realize that you've got them on the hook, and it's borderline just a turnabout of the bully tactic. That doesn't make it right, but if they're going to be rude and crude, I'm going to be ridiculous and silly, because I can have a bit of tug at them without being mean. But yeah, I try to avoid that these days because that's just toxic mentality. And I found that I have a routine these days that seems to keep me from falling down that rabbit hole, and that's to wait well after I'm awake and had some coffee before I check Twitter in the morning. And that seems to keep me from once the head clears up a little bit, I have a bit more lean on positive interaction.
I We have a couple mutual friends in our Twitter circle, and
Hmm.
one of the points that we bounce back and forth between us is I will say, you have the right to not take part in any discussion you deem unworthy.
Hmm.
If
Absolutely.
if you get to the point where the discussion doesn't offer you something of value, or somebody is bullying you into having a discussion, you have the right to put your phone down and walk away.
Yep.
And you
Yep.
can even say, this discussion doesn't interest me. They hate apathy. They want you to get really worked up. If it's like, no, this isn't what I logged in for, peace out, they have nothing to work with.
Yep. Yeah, and that's your best weapon, and that's one thing that I've learned. And that's its own victory. Really, is that how, as a lot of folks say, living rent free in your head, and that has a lot of weight. But how valuable is your time to you?
Mm-hmm.
Someone said today that time can neither be saved or wasted; it can only be spent. And I was like, ouch.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that whittles down to how do you choose to spend those minutes. And as I've gotten older, turning 45 this year, I think about I kind of accept the fact that there's probably fewer years left than there are behind now, and so once you can accept that, you really want to hold on to each moment. And so yeah, that really struck a chord with me. That how intentional are you with your time? What are you gaining from how you spend it? What else could you be doing that would be more enriching? And if I'm arguing with someone on Twitter while my kids are sitting bored in the house, I'm not spending that time well.
No.
Um, so, helping frame it around that definitely drives me in a better direction. And I shifted my interactions, my interests from, broadly political stuff and just being so to finding folks that I share this passion for Star Trek. It just hit me one day. It was like, you know, what do you actually like? What is it that you love? And it isn't politics, even though you have to pay attention. That isn't where I wanted to spend that time. And so I just searched Star Trek one day, and I started tapping follow on people who showed up. And I stumbled quite accidentally across Batleth Babe and Johnny Staggs, and just grew from there. They are both folks who will follow you back. So that those two quick interactions led to all the rest of you guys.
I'm going to go ahead and put their names in the show notes because I can vouch for both those people. They're pretty freaking awesome.
Yep.
And I will also bounce off of what you said there and about, making sure your time is well spent. I could easily be accused of wasting a lot of the time I'm doing with this podcast, with the Twitter, I do spend a fair amount of time online,
Mm-hmm.
but I've had to audit myself as far as how that time is spent. Is it really productive? Is it making my life better? Because this show is about making our lives better. This
Right.
show is about, man, I was in a bum place, but I turned on MST3K one day. It put a smile on my face. That put me on a better path through the rest of the week, through the rest of the year, through the rest of whatever.
Yep.
People who start a podcast like yours and say, I want to reach out to people, that's making our lives better. If what I'm doing is contributing to that or contributing to what you're doing, I consider it well spent.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another thing with, and I think, as like I said, I'm in a bit of a common area in the house. So doing this, random other family members are part of the show from time to time, especially on the live streams with Track Lad. All of the kids and all of the animals have been on the camera at some point. And as much as she tries to ignore it, my wife even, but yeah, it just, reaching out to these folks and just reminding everyone that we're a bit of a human. How can that be misspent time? And I like to think of it too in posterity's sake. I would love to have recordings of my grandfather doing something like this, and not to be egotistical about it, but maybe my kids and my grandkids and so on will appreciate it at a point in the future if we get there. But
that's not really. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, and I was just going to say, it just being able to connect with people and do something like this, just it felt like the right thing to do.
And that's not egotistical at all, because when you do end up doing research onto previous generations, that's the stuff that truly becomes valuable. And people save so many things that are nice but don't really give you anything of substance. Like, I've got grandpa's birth certificate and here's his high school diploma, and that's great. But
Yeah.
if your only memory of grandpa is him bouncing you on his knee when you were 3 years old and he passed away the next year, those things don't fill in the blanks. Like, grandpa liked dogs. His favorite beer was Pabst Blue Ribbon, and every Christmas he got up with a glint. That's the stuff you want, and that's the stuff that it's very hard to grab because nobody thought to record it.
Yep. And I that's the hour or so that I had to spend with folks, and do things like other shows like this one. It's just a glint, man. It's a blip in the overall existential existence. It really is just marginal. But like I said, the philosophy of the one student or the one person really is meaningful to me, because when I was a martial arts instructor, I never had my own school, but I was an instructor in other master's schools, and the rule was that you would hold class even if you were the only one there, because you are always a student. And so even if you're not sharing with others, you can teach yourself, practice your stuff. And the fact that the school is active, right? And so say someone comes strolling along and they saw an empty karate school, they're not going to be really interested in that. But if they see that one person in there who's dedicated enough to keep working, that might interest them. If they see a whole class, that's definitely going to help. But that one person may decide to come into that school, and that one person may take their first lesson with you, even if it's just the basics. And that one person may become the next grand master of your martial art, because you were there to be their mentor. You might not be the grand master, but you helped. And that's a very strong philosophy. And it goes deeper than that to, if you're the one person who took the time to respond, and unknowingly kept someone from making a poor choice, If you would just happen to be the one to say hello or be the smile that someone saw that day, that changed their day, and, didn't hurt yours. Smiles are free. Kindness is free. Sprinkle that shit everywhere.
Absolutely. And that's one of those things that it's refreshing to hear somebody say that when right now said we're struggling with people screaming at each other on every social media platform there is. And we're talking earlier about the way the internet was when we got rolling. And for the youngins here, when be in the mid 90s, when you were putting together your profile and you're setting up your email, people would say, well, you should probably put your full name on there and your phone number and maybe even your home address. This was considered good advice at the time.
At the time, right.
And we could argue as to whether it was or not, but the fact that it was considered it's like set yourself up, let people know who you are, let them know that you're a real person, and they try to act formal and nice, and that's something that's just been so lost.
It has. It's been it's been chat roomed. The decline in that started whatever. It started with, short text codes for chat rooms, BRB, AFK, things like that. When that idea spread through text messaging and things like that, communication has become inherently and overall less formal. I use a ridiculous number of memes, GIFs, and emojis for a 45-year-old man, but I do it unapologetically because that's just part of how we communicate now. And the Japanese folks were onto something when they embraced emojis and helped share them around the world. If you'll remember, back in the day, the only way to get the emojis on your phone was to enable the Japanese keyboard, because that's where they hid. And so, it's embrace it. But yeah, no, that original, I even had someone one time, that original formality is gone. And I still have my Yahoo email address, is very first outside of school email address I've had. And it's my name, Daniel Decker at yahoo.com. You can send me email there. I will never receive it. But it still works. And when I started that, I included a quote, your signature quote, right? So let people a little insight into who you are. And it was, my name and like you said, a little bit of that information. But a quote from an REM song, Driver 8. And I had someone reply back that that quote isn't very professional. It's like, well, obviously you're not someone who I want to try and continue to go to work for. I can't handle that kind of energy. But yeah, the fact that, even then I was kind of like, not everybody has email, so how can it be formal? It is obviously still, to me, in my mind, was in that geek niche. But once upon a time, I became a network administrator at a very young age. And one of the very first mistakes I made in that field was to say, oh, I want to run my own email server. You do not want to run your own email server. You do not want to run your own email server.
A lot of work, of that, very little reward.
Yep. Nope. That lesson was learned the first time. Like, we could no longer send email because I had mistakenly left it as an open relay, and we got blacklisted. So it'll do it. So yeah, no, kids, listen up. Pay somebody to host your email. They're experts for a reason.
Yeah, I got to a kick a while back how I wanted to get Google out of my life, which is still a big goal of mine. Right. And dumping my Gmail account would have been the first goal, and looking at the other options, it's like, this, you know what? I'll just have to bite that bullet for now because it's not worth any of the other alternatives.
It really isn't. And I made a mistake, a while back now, that, I got in under the, I was grandfathered into, you get to do it for free personal domain when you could have, I think up to 10 email addresses, as long as it was just a personal domain. And I shut that down under, for ridiculous reasons at the time. Now looking back, and now I'm running that same domain, but and I'm paying a host for it, and it's a reasonable price, but I still have to manage all the garbage of it. I'm not running that server myself. I'm paying Namecheap to do that for me. Because but I would, if I'd have kept it under the Google, it would have been a whole lot easier to manage. But you're right, pulling the plug on things like that, that's a heavy lift.
Yeah. And like yourself, I have made a couple choices in the past out of like reasons I thought were good at the time, but big picture really weren't.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and that's
frustrating.
Just changing technology is that something that's so manageable now is impossible down the road, and vice versa.
Yeah, exactly. And then, as formats change, and I have to get this work done because I'm in a very precarious scenario right now where I have just the right mix of technology to still claim or import the video on my old DV video cassettes from my DV video cameras that are like 20 years old now, mini DV cassettes. I have just the right mix of technology to be able to get those videos off of the tape and onto a drive and actually still be able to use them. Because I have a computer with FireWire 800, of course, and you can minimize that down to the right connection for the cameras. And so it's 9 years old, but I can still do it. And it's future proofing your historical archives, as it were, is going to be that's going to be a challenge going forward with the technology that we're using. But yeah. It's an interesting time to watch the progression of the internet from, people are just hearing about it. Everybody got some weird name for their website. Like Zoos, wasn't that a name? Like Zoos.com or something Whoopi Goldberg tried to promote. I mean, everybody just tried to have a weird name that sounded like a brand, so that they could distinguish themselves. But getting from there to here, it's been a really interesting journey,
It has been, and people, it's been such a conflict between people and the way we think and the way we behave, which is changing, and the technology, which is changing even faster. I mean, it seems like every couple of months something really clicks for weeks, and then we both go in our separate directions again.
And there's always something new trying to gain our attention too. Like the service Quibi, came along at the absolute wrong time. You can't plan for that. It had questionable veracity, in my opinion, in the first place. I was like, well, it'll be interesting to see if that plays out. But obviously, the pandemic shut the whole idea around it became untenable, and that's unfortunate for those investors. But they had a lot of money anyway. But yeah, it's something where there's always something new clamoring for our attention, and you become cynical as to, okay, well, is it going to even be around? Is it even worth what little bit of time they're asking for? It's like trying to catch up on a new show, am I, I know I have old faithful Star Trek over there, but do I really want to put the time into something new, where I actually have to pay attention right now because I've got 5 other distractions, and I can, have Star Trek in the background and know that it's there, but still, pretend to do other stuff.
This week alone, I have had 3 different apps recommended to me for various reasons, none of which I knew about, none of which might be around next year. And I've learned a very important phrase when it comes to evaluating these things. And I'm no longer afraid to say, I used to be timid, used to try to be polite. This is one case where I'm not going to be polite anymore. The phrase is, what's the fucking point?
Yeah.
If you're asking me to use an app that already does the same thing as 3 other apps on my phone, I can almost guarantee you I won't need it, I won't use it, and it probably won't be here next year.
Yep. And my home screen space as better organized as it is now, thanks to updates. But it's I don't have junk apps on my phone. I don't have junk apps on my computer. Everything I have has at some point has a purpose. and I want to, you know, I'll pay for an app, you know, 10 $20 is not unreasonable for something that either gives me a lot of joy or a lot of productivity, or a lot of productivity and joy at the same time. You know, I use the it's a lower cost photo editor called Pixelmator Pro. I think it's like $80, or maybe even less. The point is that it does everything that I could ever need from Photoshop for a lot less of the price, and it's a joy to use. They make, you know, things that I would consider outside of my wheelhouse or skill set for photo editing easy. You know, and it maybe it looks like you kind of threw some kit on it, but at the same time, it gives me everything that I need to do the artwork that I want for the projects that I have. You know, and you know, I threw together, other than the fine artwork from the Irish Trekkie for my avatar, everything around it I've thrown together myself, you know, with that tool, because one, it's fun to kind of figure out how that works, and two, like I said, it's a joy to use that kind of product. I have a ridiculous affection for my FTP client because I've used it for almost 2 decades, and you know, I pay a subscription now. I bought versions over the years, but the company Panic Software have supported the Mac for 20 plus years now, and you know, they were there before the iPod saved everything, and when, you know, being a Mac developer was not necessarily a good way to make money, and so, you know, the fact that they put the love and care into building something as mundane as an FTP client, and they look for ways to make that suck less and actually be fun, is, you know, who does that? And that's the kind of work that, you know, the work that I want to do. I like to think that, you know, throwing together the show is easy because it's basically start and stop recording, and then just make sure the QA comes out and boom, post it. You know, no theme music, no real outside production, and it's just because the tools that I use are well-crafted tools that help me build a you know, reasonably crafted product in a short amount of time. And, you know, I want to be that kind of person, you know, do the extra work, but make it look like it's not.
There's a whole host of things we could look at from what you just talked about there, in terms of, you know, the fact that you can appreciate the technology, the fact that we're moving in a direction now where people aren't using tools to get into the nuts and bolts of what they're putting together anymore. They're expecting an app to do it all, and that's probably a conversation we should have down the road, because there's so much in there.
Mm-hmm.
But if we could look at your show again and what you're putting into and what you're putting out now, let's make sure people can get interested in that, and if they want to reach out to you. So where can they find it, and what are you doing?
So you can find the show is available on all the podcast catchers, or as Anchor tells me, 8 of them, and that's where you can find it most easily. Just search for Bad Choices in Bourbon. You can follow me on Twitter at Dan Decker, DanDeckr, and you can follow the show on Twitter at Bourbon Bad. Which I thought was the best automatic name Twitter has probably ever generated. I went to go because now when you create a Twitter account, it automatically generates your handle. And most folks don't know to go change that, which is why you see a whole lot of numerical accounts now. Don't necessarily assume right away that those people are bots. Those people don't know how to go change their Twitter handle. But I went to go, you know, it's like, oh man, I've got to go see what garbage Twitter automatically generated. And there it was. And I was like, well, that's obviously perfect. So I left that. That's at Bourbon Bad, for Bad Choices in Bourbon. And with that, you know, just released episode 16 with Jill Woodman today as of this recording, and I have several guests coming up, including the 2 we talked about. Batleth Babe and Johnny Staggs are going to be future guests, as well as Starfleet Boy Olivia, and quite a few others who are coming along and to wrap up the year. And if you're interested in learning more about the folks you interact with on Twitter outside of their passion for Star Trek, then you can check us out on that show.
I'd strongly recommend it because everybody Dan just mentioned here is a very fantastic human being with a great story to tell, and I encourage you to check out their Twitter feeds and you get to know them pretty well. Dan, thank you so much for being on here. I would love to have you back anytime because this has been a lot of fun.
Oh, Aaron, man, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Take good care.
All right, you too, bud.